Hey everyone, welcome back to Ascending with Ashleigh. I'm Ashleigh, and today is Freedom Friday, and I want to continue talking about breaking down the DSM. And we left off with the first publishing of the DSM, which was in 1952, and now we're moving into the second publishing, which was published in 1968. And so I just want to touch on a few important things. My hope for this is really to just illustrate how the social control within the mental health model in the United States and the publishing and writing and expansion of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders really combats social unrest and movements within the United States. So we all know that the 1960s were big civil rights and other like labor movements, the women's movement, we had disability movements, environmental movements, so there was a lot of civil unrest, a lot of social movements in that decade, and going into the second DSM, again published in 1968, I just want to really show that it counters the way that folks were fighting back and uplifting the good of people, and how the model continues to create these diagnostic categories to label the behavior of folks fighting for their rights, okay? That's the biggest thing I want us to get from this series. So the second Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, like I said, was published in 1968, and below in the description box I have a very rough timeline of just some of the civil rights movement, some of the movements that were happening, and then I also have information about how the DSM was expanded and how categories of illness or mental hygiene were added to combat that information or those movements. Something really important about the 1968 publishing of the DSM was that this edition started to have a global effect. So in medical coding, there's the coding which is called the ICD-9. So that's how it's not the ICD-9 anymore. I apologize. That's what it was when I was working in insurance. But it's the ICD, which is the International Coding of Diagnoses. And so the 1968 publishing of the DSM also was the first time that the DSM used that global coding or that international coding. And so what this did was this made the mental health aspect like expand to an international global level, which I have a lot to say about, but I don't have a lot of time because I don't have a lot on my phone. But so what that did was it promoted this global context for mental health. And again, as I've stated in previous videos, when folks aren't having their human rights met, no access to water, food, shelter, or inadequate living environments, their behavior, the emotional states, their overall life, and it's going to reflect that, right? So all that to say is the 1960s were huge in the United States, but they were also, it was a really powerful decade for global movements as well. So what I just want to share is that, so it was a major moment in revolutionary thought throughout the world, and it was expanded from 112 mental disorders to 145 within the DSM. And according to Ernest M. Grunberg, who is an MD, doctor, and a PhD, he was the chairman of nomenclature and statistics for the APA, which is the American Psychiatric Association. And he says, this second edition of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, DSM-2, reflects the growth of the concept that the people of all nations live in one world, right? And so that speaks to the ICD, which is, I apologize if I didn't say this correctly, but it's the International Classification of Diseases. And so what they did was that they partnered up, the APA partnered up with the WHO, the World Health Organization, which again, in this moment in time we're hearing a lot about with COVID, and they adopted the ICD to expand worldwide, to expand globally, which is another aspect of globalization. So what he also said was the rapid integration of psychiatry with the rest of medicine also helped create a need to have psychiatric nomenclature, which just means nomenclature is just like a vocabulary of or like words that people can agree on to label things, right? So the whole entire DSM is just words with these behaviors to match these words, right? So the schizophrenia, the bipolar, the OCD, all of those things are just within nomenclature, which is a common understanding of language to classify and identify behavior. And that's basically just what the DSM is. So anyway, the rapid integration of psychiatry with the rest of medicine also helped create to have psychiatry nomenclature and classifications closely integrated with those of other medical practitioners. So this, again, is really important because of the social unrest that we know about the 60s, especially here in the United States, but also globally, and these powers that be expanding this work to include the entire world, saying, again, that people of all nations live in one world. Yes, we do live in one world, but every nation, even state-wise, is different, has different problems, different governments, different ways of existing, different economies. All of those things factor into people's mental health, because if people's basic human rights are not being met, which we know when people are fighting back with civil unrest, with social movements, people are fighting to have their rights be taken seriously, their lives taken seriously. And so what I see when I look at the DSM and when I did all this work is that countering the social movements was more categories of mental illness, because once you're identified as mentally ill, you can be stripped of your agency completely. If they deem you unsafe, unfit to be in society, they can lock you up for the rest of your life. The court is a part of this here in the United States. Jails and prisons are also a part of this. If you if someone commits a crime, but is found mentally ill, and we see this especially in the United States with white people, myself included, that your punishment or your behavioral rehabilitation will be determined beyond, or like because of your status or privilege, right? That's huge, it's important, and it's 100% fact. I myself have been through it. So what I want to talk about quickly, is just some of the ways that the DSM expanded. So in 1952, with the first publishing, they just had like 3 broad classes of psychopathy, whatever, which was organic brain syndromes, epilepsy, functional disorders like depression and schizophrenia, mental deficiency, which was known as mental retardation or intellectual disability. So in the 1968 edition, those 3 major classes were expanded to 11. Now listen to what they expanded them to. Group delinquent reaction. Okay, that is 100% in response to groups organizing for their human rights. Hyperkinetic reaction, so if folks were violent or if their bodies fought back, they would be diagnosed with a mental health issue. Over anxious reaction, runaway reaction, unsocialized aggressive reaction, and withdrawing reaction. So again, one thing I just really want to talk about is this nomenclature, and how the APA puts these books together and upgrades these editions years after years, it's in a direct correlation to society and civil disobedience, civil unrest, social movements, people fighting back, people demanding that they be heard. A way that we can prove this is that the DSM-2 was published with a fix-it or whatever. The 7th printing was in 1974, and homosexuality was removed as a mental disorder that year following protests of gay rights activists. So what we know is that some groups of people, we already know this living in society, are favored and privileged over others. So yes, you had people fighting for civil rights, the environment, women's rights, gay rights, labor rights, but the only thing that they took out was homosexuality. And then we've even seen that in the early 2000s when homosexuality became legal. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing, I'm saying that that's amazing, but what I'm saying is that they continue to pit people against each other by having these oppression Olympics, right? And so the fact that they were able to deem homosexuality as a disorder, and then with the social unrest and the fight back took it out, is a huge testament to the fact that that was never a mental disorder. And I would love to look closely at the DSM with you all, but you know, this is just a starter to get you to do your own research and to start thinking about how this counters social movements, right? And how it is in direct correlation and relationship to human rights and the expansion of human rights and the continuation of capitalism, the continuation of boxing people, diagnosing them, deeming them unfit for society, and literally locking them away, right? So those are the big things I want to talk about. If you are super interested in this or you'd like more information, because I know I talk fast, please look at the description box below. There's a playlist with some music from the 60s. There's a couple quotes from folks within that time frame. And there's also a pretty broad timeline of some of the events within the movements that happened, just to get you thinking about how this has been done, right? So the big thing about the DSM-2 was that it joined the WHO, the World Health Organization, and the classification and the coding was added into the medical field at a global scale. And then also that social unrest did change it, and that the uprisings around gay rights were heard and omitted from the book, right? So I love you all. Thank you again for being here. Please check out the description box below. And next week we're going to talk about the 3rd edition of the DSM, which was published in 1980. And that's a big one because 80s was kind of when shit started hitting the fan with Reagan and Reaganomics and the Federal Reserve, all of that. So we're going to talk about that next time. I appreciate you all being here so much, and I'm really excited to be thinking about things from this way. Instead of blaming an individual for their reaction, we're looking at the context of the environment and the system within that, and how that's used to keep people down. So, all right, y'all. I hope you have a good one, and thank you so much for being here. Again, check out the description box, and I will see you next week. Bye.